Yes, welcome to the Grassy Knoll, and this is going to be round 2 with Andrew Colvin. We're dealing with the Mothman, and he is a documentary filmmaker, and he's produced The Mothman's Photographer. And you can go find out about that on andycolvin.com and look under film, and he has a DVD series there that explains all about the Mothman. We're going to touch base a little bit on what we talked about in the first hour and then move on into the second hour. But first, I want to thank you, Andrew, for coming back with us on the Grassy Knoll.
Thank you, Viz.
I want to open up by something that we found very interesting. And what it was that I had asked Andrew for an outline, which I do with a lot of guests. And he had sent me something originally, and that did not contain the notes of the show. There were some, shall we say, ancillary things he sent me. And I'm waiting for the second email to come through, and it doesn't come through, and we're ready to go just minutes ago, and I'm saying, well, I didn't get it. And he said, well, gee, I sent it to you. And then he mentioned, well, why don't you tell me what you told me? Tell them what you told me about what was in that email.
Well, knowing what I know about the data mining, the scandal that's happening right now with the NSA, quote, international spying or domestic spying, is that one of the key folks I interview in my documentary, one of my childhood friends, her father worked on that project, and it was operational by '68. So they were listening to domestic, all traffic, actually, by that time. And if you go to Bamford's Puzzle Palace, you can find out more about it. They actually do it in West Virginia at a naval facility there.
Now, the other interesting thing about what you sent me was that everything that you have sent me to the Hotmail address has come into the regular inbox. This particular piece that came late and of which we are speaking came into the junk box, which I wonder, I don't know how things work with as far as how MSN does these things, but I'm wondering if somebody got their little paws on it and put some kind of imprint on it that when it came in, it did not see, my Hotmail did not see it as it did the other ones. And I'm not trying to get paranoid or neurotic, but that doesn't necessarily make me wrong, does it?
No, it's possible. There's a lot of code words in that email that I sent. It's got but the outline of what we're going to
all the basic
cover here in the next 2 hours. So
all the basic food groups are in this one, right? Oh, jeez. Okay.
There are so many threads to the Mothman story. It's truly an enigma inside of an enigma, and on and on and on.
Yeah,
and
right.
And you and I were talking yesterday after the first hour about whether or not, how difficult it is to tell which parts of it are mind control operations or government covert ops versus something that's genuinely supernatural. And I vacillate back and forth on certain parts of it all the time.
Well, I have to tell the listeners, we're not being gratuitous and trying to make this bigger than it is. Andrew's right. After the hour, we spoke a little bit. And this thing does have tentacles. There's no two ways about it. And even you mentioned the fact that even if there's some kind of perhaps MK Ultra thing attached to it or some kind of suggestive, I don't know, technology that's being used, somehow, some way, something is definitely going on in and around this whole event and continuing event in that Ohio Valley region. What I want to ask you, though, is, and I thought about this before, and it may not be that important, but, again, is there anything out there that gives the most accurate depiction of what the Mothman looks like?
Oh, boy. That opens up another line of questioning because it appears to change somewhat, or... Okay. It looks slightly different to different people. Sometimes there's more of a head-like, or a bird-like head, or sometimes there's more of a dog-like head. And believe it or not, there's a strange connection to the story of Ezekiel in the Bible, and that would take too long to explain it all. But someone I know had a dream about Ezekiel's wheel over this area. Mound, West Virginia, where we all lived. And if you look at, I found a drawing of Ezekiel's wheel from the 1100s that showed a beast, a flying creature that was linked to, flying with this wheel. And it had 4 different faces, and they were all different animals, the 4 that we find mostly seen in conjunction with the Mothman sightings. How about that?
Well, yeah, I'll take that as
when I saw that.
I'll take that as a no. That there isn't a most accurate depiction. But again, you raised something else, and if you remember the classic movie, The Wizard of Oz, with the winged monkeys.
Yes.
I mean, we've seen wings affixed to a number of creatures. I don't think that that's anything that's new to this century or whatever. And I'll tell you what, though, even when I was a little kid and I saw that creeped me out. That whole section with the monkeys and the flying stuff, I mean, that to me wasn't a little kid thing. I found that, and I'm sure you know what's behind The Wizard of Oz as well, right? The whole story with that, but...
Well, briefly, it would be, Levin covers a lot of things in his trilogy, the Sinister Forces trilogy, and that movie is one of them. He talks about the fact that it appears that movie was used, and also the book, The Bluebird, by Maeterlinck. Both of those were made into, Oz and this Bluebird were both dramatic productions in theater as well as in film, and there's a lot of evidence that they used these themes as mind control programs when they came up with the various ways to program assassins for military ops.
Well, I missed you on who wrote the trilogy. Were you talking about the Wizard of Oz books? Or the book, the author of which his name escapes me now. Is he the one?
No, Peter Levenda.
Oh, Levenda, sure, okay.
His Sinister Forces trilogy covers a lot of things, and he covers how they came up with some of the ways to do programming. But you have several families of programming, like Bluebird, Monarch, those kinds of MK Ultra type programs.
Programs, right. Okay, one other thing, and before we get into the meat of the matter, if folks group Mothman in with, let's say, the Yeti, the sightings of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and such, first of all, do you necessarily think that there aren't creatures like that out there? And secondly, if there are or there aren't, is it an insult, so to speak, or a degradation to put Mothman into that whole category?
Well, I'm not sure, because I vacillate a bit there in terms of what we can say. It's tough. It's a tough question.
I'm not so sure that there isn't something out there. Unfortunately, it's just become so much of a kind of a Hollywood thing. That you never, I don't know if you can ever strip it all back to get to the truth of what might really exist out there. If there's some anomalies, biologically, that still exist to this day. I mean, the same thing even with, with Champ, the supposed Loch Ness monster, that's hanging out in the Champlain. I mean, who knows? Who knows?
There's an interesting Bigfoot film that I saw. Well, actually, it was a little clip that someone had filmed called the July 4th footage, and it was debunked somewhat, but I'm not sure if it really was debunked. But the footage shows a Bigfoot running, and then at the end of the clip, it appears to be growing wings. Mm-hmm. And I think, there were a lot of Bigfoot incidents going on at the same time as the Mothman, and I'm very interested in whether or not these two are related. I think they may be cousins, or if it's a shape-shifting creature, it may be the same creature.
Yeah.
Because, Mothman basically looks like a Bigfoot with wings. That's pretty much, what it looks like. Except for the head may appear to look a little different to people. But, when people are under stress of seeing, this otherworldly thing, it can distort your perceptions. And there's obviously an interaction going on with the mind. When we went back in 2002 and encountered this energy field, we later had some visions that were really odd. They seemed to imply that there had been a drowning at the confluence of the Elk and Kanawha rivers. And 3 days later, I was driving by there. I had sort of been avoiding that area during my trip that week, and the last night I drove by it, and there was a drowning as I went by. They were fishing someone out of the river. So at that time I thought, well, that was just a precognition of something that was going to happen 3 days later. But then we found out that in 1904, that bridge had collapsed that crosses the Elk River right there. And the date was the same exact date as the Silver Bridge collapse, December 15th. And there's an island there called Magic Island, and there have always been stories about it being a supernatural spot. Mm-hmm. And I remember my mother telling me a story about a dead girl that had haunted the island, but she didn't know about the bridge collapse. But the deaths were caused by this bridge collapsing from lax maintenance, and it killed some children. And the interesting thing is that the place that we saw this energy field, there used to be an old school there from, like a pioneer school from the 1800s that burned down. And there seems to be a link with children dying, that somehow it creates an energy force. Or if there's a magnetic anomaly there in the earth, it can store that information somehow and then project it back to people later. Mm-hmm. There's also an old church there, and it's a crossroads of old Indian tracks. And that reminds me, I wanted to touch back on the mounds again, because I really didn't get to finish my thought on that the first time.
Sure.
This road we lived on dead ends into Blaine Island, where this witness had a dream of the Ezekiel's wheel, and this island was. It used to be, and the banks all had these hundreds, even thousands of mounds, I've been told, that were all mowed down to make room for these various chemical plants, which are still, it's all Navy land, actually, pretty much. Most of the plants are on Navy land, so it's actually technically a Navy reservation with these private entities operating on the land. But these mounds, I've done some research on mounds, and if you look at Ted Holliday's work, he's got a book called The Dragon and the Disc, and he connects the mounds to UFO worship and dragon sightings. Dragons were known to typically come out of a cave and then move downstream to a mound, and with maybe in the middle of a stream or an island in a stream, they would mount and live there. So a lot of the British tales of dragon lore fighting involved killing a dragon on an island in a river or on the banks of a river on a mountain. That's one aspect of it now. And I also have been in contact with a Bigfoot contactee who claims that they're communicating with Bigfoot on a regular basis, and the Bigfoots have told them that they built the mounds. That implies that's something that can't really be verified, but it's still an interesting link, possible link that other researchers could look into as they interview contactees. In the case of the Mothman, there's some evidence that he started way upriver, up the Elk River, came down the Kanawha, and then ended up habitating the mounds of Point Pleasant, where they have the TNT area with all the munitions mounds. There's hundreds of these World War I and II era bunkers that were made for storing TNT. DuPont was operating the plant. And today it's a highly toxic Superfund site. But that's where Mothman was seen sort of hanging out at night and taking a break from when he wasn't flying around. And I've also found a corollary to that same kind of coming out of the cave and moving downstream thing in the Egyptian lore with the story of Horus and Seth. They're both birdmen, but Horus is a bird-like birdman, and Seth is a dog-like
dog-head
birdman.
Mm-hmm.
And they are known to occupy upstream and downstream. So Seth is upstream, Horus is downstream. And it's interesting because the sightings in my area were more dog-like, and we're upstream about 30 miles from Point Pleasant. And then in Point Pleasant, it was seen with more of a bird face.
When you talk about Horus, you're talking about necessarily the descendant of Isis and Osiris?
Yeah, it's, you know, I've been to Egypt and did some research on it when I went, and some of these animals change. You know, their Horus can be depicted several ways. So there's a shape-shifting, you know, quality to the Egyptian stories, but it's primarily, you know, he's primarily a bird most of the time.
Well, you know, I'll throw this at you, and I don't mean to jump you with it, but I mean the way we feel, and most of us who listen to this show, and that is we look at high-degree Freemasonry as being an extension of the Mystery Babylon religions, the Egyptian sun god worship.
Yep.
And so therefore, you know, we believe that satanic, Luciferian, whatever you want to call it, spirituality still exists and goes on, and is very, very palpable. And so when you mention something like this, you know, I got to tell you, Andrew, what most of us have found out is that the longer we go and we document and research these things, you realize that most of the stuff we were told was Boulder Dash and fiction really wasn't. It was portrayed as fiction. It was a good story. It probably conditioned us to a certain extent not to really look at it as real, if you know what I mean. But it is real, and it's out there, and we're just trying to get people to turn around and say, listen, what you guys are poo-pooing isn't necessarily, a fictional tale.
Well, there's certainly some interesting, bringing it back to something more personal that I can talk about,
Sure.
Interesting unconscious uprisings of things in my own story that to illustrate this idea that I was just talking about is back in the early 80s, I started a photo series that involved a flying terrorist who was like a birdman who had a sphere that he carried, and a lot of the Garuda stories have spheres. I didn't know any of this at the time, but I was doing this artwork that unconsciously represents a lot of the aspects of the Mothman story. And the themes in the photographs I took are very, you know, a lot of them relate to the Mothman story, the connection possibly with Christ, the Thunderbird, trees. There's a thing where the Mothman appears like a tree or masquerades as a tree. But I started off the series with this being coming out of the ground. I was doing double exposures and showing this being coming out of the ground with its arms spread. And then when I was talking to Keel in the documentary, he was saying that there are reports of Bigfoot pulling themselves out of the ground, and as if they are molecularly, you know, spread apart, so that they're not like the dirt isn't moving when they come out of the ground. They're just coming up out of the ground as if they are ghosts or that kind of thing. So it's a very similar idea that these creatures come out of the earth and then will go to a mound because there's some energy. There's something, you know, whoever built the mounds, you know, there's some interesting things about the types of clay that they use. They pick specific kinds of dirt that has certain properties. And that perhaps these mounds can hold information in a way similar to how some of the Mexican Indians believed and the South American Indians believed that a shaman could project his consciousness into a rock or a mound at the point of death and then survive on. It's pretty mystical, but my point is that these things have cropped up in my life and in some of the stories of the witnesses I interviewed in this way. And it's hard to imagine how that, you know, could happen without there being something to it.
I'm going to ask you a loaded question, and I think a lot of people might say that's a softball question to ask somebody, but this is my belief. I just want you to speak to it. I've passed by some people who I believe have done things, works, especially books, about spiritual/mystical things, and I'm like, nah, I don't think so, because I thought they were more, if you will, carny barkers and salesmen, snake oil salesmen, than they were serious researchers. In your case, from what I've gotten, from everything I've said, we've talked about, and I mean, I'm measuring these words very, very carefully, but I believe that you're deadly serious about this whole situation, and and as we said, the tributaries that run from it, as far as what's going on and has been going on in the United States?
Well, I am. However, there are so many possibilities for explanations. It's tough to nail one down. It's just going to take time and more people getting involved with the research. Myself, for the next 10 years, probably I'm not going to have much time due to family things. So, I'm passing on what I know in the hopes that others can take it and run with it. I sort of view my own work as being an addendum to the things that Keel did. I was leafing through his book again last night, and it's really got a lot of amazing. Every time I read it, there's some different things that pop out that I wasn't able to assimilate the first time or the second time or the third time that I read it. It's so chock full of interesting angles, particularly describing for the reader how superspectrum works, which is the energy force of reality, so to speak. And Keel explains that really well, and he also goes into this conspiracy angles quite a bit. And I view my work as just extending a little more of that direction, based on what other researchers have come up with in the past few years, which I don't know if Keel's kept up with that stuff or not. But anyway.
All right, a couple things. Knowing your connection to all this, then I'm going to guess that the two mining accidents in West Virginia. What were your reactions to that? And does Mothman fit into this?
Oh boy, I wouldn't go that far. I thought about it just because the Hatfield and McCloy name came up. Well, McCloy, one of the guys' names was McCloy, which is an interesting name because it shows up a lot in CIA lore.
You got it. That's right.
So I was kind of making jokes that it was the Hatfield and McCloy. Not
right.
Anyway, it would have certainly been a bad joke to make, but
when you did hear about the two of them, and I guess, now let me ask you this: are you necessarily waiting for the next shoe to drop? I mean, do we believe that things happen in threes? They certainly seem like they do, but how did you take it?
I wondered if it was a diversion. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, there's a history in West Virginia of exploiting the population for resources, and some of these explosions are unexplained, and who knows what's going on there. There could be some more union problems going on in the mines. I don't know.
So necessarily, this might be a tragic coincidence that two of them would happen in such close proximity to one another. On the other hand, you think something might be afoot.
Well, it entered my head, but you
have nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't be something I'd want to talk about too much because there's so many other things with the Mothman that I'd like to touch on.
Sure.
Based on the notes that we're working with now.
All right, look, at this time, though, also, I want to tell everybody you're listening to the Grassy Knoll on AM 1610 WDCX. This is Viz, and with us today is Andrew Colvin. His website is andycolvin.com. But Andy, there's a couple of things you want to talk about related to your work and those around who have supported you, at this time especially. Do you want to give us a recount of that?
Oh, yes. I wanted to thank Vidya Gallery in Seattle, VIDYA, for sponsoring a Mothman show this year for me. 300 images, screens running the documentary. Tell your paranormal video booth. We're going to have some lectures. Also, we have a nice little circle of artists here in Seattle who all seem to have paranormal experiences in their backgrounds, and I've interviewed some of them for the documentary. Particularly two of them, Bill Frisell and Jim Woodring. Frisell's a guitar virtuoso he's well known around the world, and so is Jim as an artist. And they're doing a multimedia event at Carnegie Hall in New York City sometime soon. I forget the date, but if you do a search on Carnegie Hall, you'll find it. Frizzell's mother is from West Virginia, and he's a big Mothman fan, and Jim and his wife, Mary, have both contributed as interviews to the documentary because they both had precognitions of 911. And Jim actually had a drawing that he did of a plane coming down and crashing into a fat cat, like the stereotypical fat cat you see, the robber baron with the big cigar. Mm-hmm. And it came out the day of, but he had to withdraw it because he didn't want it to, it would have seemed really, like a really cruel joke. So he had to pull it from publication. And there were several other people that I know that had similar things where they'd actually drawn pictures, artists who had drawn pictures that depicted something similar to the event right before it happened. And I also wanted to throw out a couple more names of guys, people in this circle that have been supportive. Chris Ware, he's a famous cartoonist who's done several interesting books. Charles Kraft, a guy here in town who is known for his bone. It's human bone porcelain. And he takes the remains of folks and makes porcelain items out of them. It's a fascinating endeavor. And he also does various firearms and military things out of porcelain. He does a really interesting work. And Bruce Pickford is another guy here in town who did the claymation for Frank Zappa. These are all guys that have been inspirational to me, and who all have paranormal events in their lives. Like Frizzell had a UFO sighting he grew up in Denver, outside of Denver. What's that town there with all the Colorado Springs, where Tesla did all his testing in the mountains there. Mm-hmm. And also Graham Nash. Sorry about that. What was that? A phone call?
We're all right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Did you hear a noise?
No, we just cut out. We're good.
All right. And Graham Nash has brought a couple of photos. And I wanted to remind people to check out the blog that I have. It's at andycolvin.com/WordPress. WORDPRESS. And there's an interesting article on there, I think, based on trying to describe the meaning of the word Indrid Cold. Indrid Cold is this spaceman, so to speak, who showed up during the Mothman flap.
Where can we find that, Andy?
At andycolvin.com/WordPress.
Okay. I'm going in.
We need to put a good link on there, easy to see link, and we'll do that.
Okay, because that's just it. I was looking for it and I couldn't find it. Now I've got it. Is it a blog of sorts?
Yes.
Okay.
And I started it off with this article on Indrid Cold because I realized that, as I was researching the Garuda, most of the Garuda tales, and these are tales that are, 6,000 years old, coming from India. Some of the oldest stories in Hindu lore involve the Garuda. And the Garuda was always known to be associated with Indra, the god of fire. And usually this Indra was, at times of cataclysm, Indra sort of takes over and is known for destruction. So it's almost like you could almost correlate it to nuclear, weaponry. And the Garuda usually, in fact, there's tales. There's a couple of guys have written books about these flying machines that they had in ancient India, and even perhaps had rockets and things. It's a whole other field that I haven't explored in depth, but it's out there. David Hatcher Childress has a book on it. The Vimanas were these flying Indian machines. But where was I? The Garuda, Indra. Garuda is known to cool the fires of Indra, and it's this messianic kind of thing where he's stopping the destruction. And I realized that Indrid Cold was a name that related to that. Indra, if the Garuda has cooled down Indra, he has become Indrid. It's like a past tense. Indrid is like a past tense of Indra, or an adjective of Indra. And cold, is an obvious allusion to the cooling down of the fires. So Indrid Cold, MIB spaceman was basically saying that he was the Garuda. And that raises other questions. Would a supernatural deity, tell you that? Would he come out and just say who he was, or was this a human endeavor? Using people who know a lot about history to concoct, baffling coded stories for people.
Going back to the storyline with Mothman. Now, I don't know where you want to go with it. Do you want to talk more about some of the connections that come out of Woodward Drive?
Yes, back to the 1904 bridge collapse. That was the same year that Aleister Crowley did his one of his major rituals, and he said that we had now entered the age of Horus and the conquering children, whatever that means. But that's what happened in the same year. In the documentary, we have some interesting things that sort of occurred at this place with my friend Harriet, whose father was the guy who worked at the naval facility. She had some strange dreams about this confluence before. She had never been there, and during the filming, we went there, and we ran into, by total random chance, Harriet needed a place to stay, and she stayed with a lady who was recommended to us. Turns out this lady, her daughter had moved into Harriet's house on Woodward Drive after Harriet had moved away, and that this woman had a bunch of strange paranormal experiences there too, and we interviewed her as well. And there was a business located at this confluence of the rivers that employed most of the men that lived on my road, which was miles away. So there's these strange connections to this spot, just geographically. And let's see, I've got my notes here. It's linking on to. There's so many things. There's so many directions to go at any time. It's a little mind-boggling.
It is, and that's why I left it up to you. Because,
from here I could talk more about Harriet's family, or I could branch off into the Tad Jones sighting, which is a famous sighting that Keel wrote about.
Well, when we go with Harriet's family, then we'll go to Tad Jones, because when you mentioned Harriet, you said her father worked at a naval facility. Would that be Norfolk?
No, actually, in his early days, when my dad was at Norfolk, Harriet's dad was at Hamilton Field, which comes into the UFO lore via the Maury Island UFO event here in Seattle. The two guys that were killed were operating out of Hamilton.
Is Hamilton out by you?
Hamilton's in California.
Okay, whereabouts in California? I don't know.
San Francisco.
Okay.
We did some interesting things happened there when we were filming. With Harriet. Harriet went to hypnosis school, and I went with her and filmed it. And we went to Hamilton and did some remote viewing, because she has these abilities to remote view and also to medically intuit people's illnesses. And she's just got some really amazing talent. And we were attracted to this little town called San Anselmo, where we would film and talk about things. And it turns out later that that's where Manson lived when he was right after he got out of prison, when he was living in San Francisco. But we did some filming there, and she went back again a few months later for some more courses. And during that time, there were some things going on. Like there was a Mothman sighting in Alaska. This is in 2003 now. And I wrote to her about them, and she goes, and I go, what do you think it means? And she goes, it's going to be an earthquake. And 2 days later, there was an earthquake. And but when she was there again, at this point 6 months later, she and two other folks saw a missile crossing San Francisco, and saw it be shot out of the sky by a laser, some kind of laser from above. And it made the news, but they sort of whitewashed it. They claimed it was shot down by a missile out over the ocean.
All right.
So it was some kind of test or something.
All right. This is a real event, then.
Yes. Yeah. But then 2 weeks later, the Army admitted that it had done some laser testing, but they claimed it was in New Mexico.
Well, what do you make of that?
I don't know. It was just these are just. I'm sort of just touching on the many strange things that happened while we were making this documentary. It's synchronicity after synchronicity.
Well, with her father, that was involved with the Navy, and I know your dad had some involvement with the Philadelphia experiment. Is that correct?
He was there, and he was always very tight-lipped about whatever he did in the military. There's not much to go on. But he was on the USS Roosevelt aircraft carrier. And there was some connection to the Roosevelt family with my dad. He said he had flown planes at their place in Hyde Park. And if you go back further to Verplanck Colvin, in our family, Verplanck had a relationship with Teddy Roosevelt, a close relationship, and was hobnobbing with the Astors and the DuPonts and the Morgans and so forth up there in upstate New York. But Verplanck sort of fell out of favor, and because he was his work with the Adirondack Park had sort of stymied the Tories. He kept the Tory line, the New York bankers who were sort of aligned with Britain. It kept the Brits from buying up all of northern upstate New York. That was their original intent, was sort of make it all part of Canada.
What was the timeline for Verplanck's life?
He did a lot of important work there from like 1850, 1860 to the early part of the 19th century or 1900s.
All right, so he was an elder person when he had this involved relationship with Teddy.
No, actually, he started pretty early. Well, I don't know. I mean, when was Teddy?
Well, Teddy's a president in the first decade of the 20th century.
Right.
So I
may have been a little older. It may have been a little, may have been a little older than Teddy.
But what's interesting is you now say it, because I'm very familiar with Adirondack Park, which nowadays nobody can figure out what exactly it is. But because I mean, this land management issue is another whole can of worms. But you're saying Mr. Colvin necessarily was trying not to have all this land scapped up by that still to this day continuing Tory arm of bankers from the East Bank of the Hudson.
Yes, and I don't know if my father may have been linked into that. He may have been. It seems like there's some connection to the Roosevelts. And my father's death was suspicious. He died about 4 years after the Mothman events, and he worked at Carbide. He was a chemical guy, and whenever they would have spills and things, he would have to go in and sort of supervise what was the spills, and he ended up getting exposed to some things. So he got this rare muscle cancer in his leg, which it turns out a lot of Carbide employees were getting, and they actually had to address it at a national level at one point in I think 1974. It became a scandal. So my father was sent to Cleveland for treatment, which was kind of odd, and he was they took it out. But then one night he claimed he had been jabbed or stabbed in the middle of the night, like someone had actually come into the house. That was there was this. And we all sort of have nightmares of these intrusions, or at least a couple of intrusions. But he felt that he'd been stabbed in a part of his back, and then a few weeks later he developed a cancer there. Which I can come back to this story later,
okay.
Because it may connect to a guy who is known in the Mothman story as the Fright Wig.
The what?
The Fright Wig man. He wore a fright wig.
Okay.
And he was abducting people and doing this kind of thing where he, might come into your home or chase you in a car, or he was basically trying to grab people. Who knows what he was doing with them? But in '75, Keel reported that they found 25 skeletons in a cave near Point Pleasant. So he even states at one point that he feels like that these abductions were key to understanding whatever conspiracy might have been behind the Mothman.
hold on a second.
I'd like to save that for the third
Okay.
hour.
All right, good.
Getting back to Harriet, her dad was an engineer working for Western Electric, worked on this facility. His car was bombed in early '68, right after the Mothman, right after the Silver Bridge collapsed. The same day as that car bombing, there was a big fire in downtown Charleston of a mob restaurant. The owner of the restaurant fled to Bluefield and was shot in a hotel room. There was some kind of operation, some kind of mob fighting going on. Harriet's neighbor at the time was a member of the Bruno family. Well, his last name was Bruno, and we're figuring that he's connected to the Philadelphia family.
Yeah, okay.
Because other books that I've found have drawn a line between Philadelphia and West Virginia, sort of the mob in that part of the world being run out of Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
But this Bruno guy lived next door, and the FBI came, but strangely they drove Volkswagen, which is very similar to, that's what Indrid Cole drove. Well, this guy's FBI agent tells Harriet's family that the car bombing had to do with this mob guy next door, not them. But he was strange. Harriet remembers him paying more attention to her than the case. So he had some strange behaviors, like he was a man in black. Bruno was eventually. Well, the next thing that happened was Harriet found a suitcase of heroin between her house and their house, and they reported that to the FBI. And Bruno was put on trial, but disappeared into the prison system. No one knows what happened to him. So that's kind of an angle that no one quite knows what it was all about, but it shows that there was drug shipment going through Charleston. There was also some plane crashes that occurred in the early 70s there, and it may or may not tie into the Bluegrass Conspiracy, which is another book I'll throw out for people that are interested in that angle. The sort of drug occult military covert things that were going on in Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia.
Do you want to tell us that title?
The Bluegrass Conspiracy.
And that's by?
I can't remember her name offhand.
Okay.
Here it is. Sally Denton.
Okay.
There's a lot of defense plants there, and there's some evidence they were making untraceable weapons and shipping them around the world for to support various paramilitary operations.
And this is in West Virginia, correct?
Yes. In fact, most of the bullets are made in West Virginia for the Iraq War nowadays. There's a big company called ATK, which has moved into the Clarksburg area, which is where Ray Barker had his operations. ATK and some other NASA-type companies. They build engines for some of the shuttles there. So West Virginia has had a resurgence of this military contracting.
Who do you attribute that to? I mean, is this because it's been the purview of the Rockefellers and also Byrd? Yeah,
and cheap labor too.
And who?
Cheap labor, okay. Geographical isolation. Yeah.
Well, I tell you, that is an interesting place, and also you can't really overlook either the proximity of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, can you?
Oh, absolutely. It's a straight shot from Wright-Patterson through Point Pleasant to all these chemical plants. And one side note that just popped into my head, my father was at the Philadelphia experiment. He was then was moved to Charleston to work in one of the plants, and I had a summer job at a DuPont plant there. And I talked to several guys who had seen someone running on fire and then disappear. And it was a ghost story, as far as everyone knew. But these people had definitely seen it, and firsthand. And I knew, and they were scared when they talked about it. It shook them up, and it happened more than once. And this year I was reading a book on the Philadelphia experiment, And it turns out that that's the description of what happens to the guys that were on the ship that was doused with all of these degaussing waves. That they would burst into flames and disappear. How's that? I mean, I was told this story, 25 years ago, and I always remembered it. And sure enough, it connects to the Philadelphia experiment somehow. It sounds too hard to believe, but I can tell you could probably go there today and find some guys that remember it, that had actually seen it firsthand.
When you went back to West Virginia and did the documentary and such, were you ever confronted with any kind of resistance or suggestions by the locals that maybe this isn't a good idea for you to do?
No. We took kind of a, for whatever reason, I'm not out to, I'm really not out to, this is not like an activism kind of thing for me. It's more finding out what happened to, did my dad, was he really murdered? It's more personal, and I have a sense of humor, so there's a lot of things in the movie that we sort of took a lighthearted approach to it, and I don't think anyone got the idea that we were going to.
Oh no, believe me, I didn't even think of it, being a radical activist. Just asking questions sometimes in certain places cannot be appreciated, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
All right, I didn't know if just asking what you did or whatever put you in any kind of jeopardy, but you're telling me no, not that you know of whatsoever.
No, people were great, and it's amazing the more people just don't go out with a camera and find witnesses. These Mothman witnesses are not going to be around forever. And we're starting to get, some of us are 50 who were very young at the time, so, 20 more years and going to see a steep drop-off in the witnesses.
Well, I tell you what, with the way things may be going, I'm not so sure that those sightings won't increase in frequency in the years and decades to come. And that's well, I mean, that's given the fact that I had asked you in the first hour whether this was a nefarious creature, somebody who would foretell bad tidings. Like I said, as associated with the owl and stuff, and you said no. In fact, it was the other way around, that the sighting necessarily meant something positive, even though it might also foretell that an event was going to happen. Is that more or less right?
Yes. And I have vacillated a bit on whether or not it was a mind control operation, because my Mothman contactee friend, Timmy, his father worked for Carbide as an engineer, just like Harriet's dad was an engineer, and they probably knew the engineers that were involved in the Tad Jones sighting that Keel wrote about. Tad Jones had been an engineer at Carbide, and the guy who investigated, along with Keel, Ralph Jarrett, he was a Carbide engineer. My father actually knew him, and Tad Jones leaves a job as an engineer to become an appliance salesman, which is kind of odd.
Yeah, now we said we were going to go to the Tad Jones thing.
Okay.
Well, that's it. I mean, I wanted to go off with Harriet. We kind of did that. And the second thing that you had mentioned, and I'd like to go into that right now for the balance of the show, is what in the world is going on with what Tad Jones was involved with.
Well, he was driving on a part of the interstate that was just opened. Excuse me. This is right a few miles, maybe 2, 3, 4 miles west of Mound, on I-64, and he sees a sphere hovering above the interstate. Reports it to. It gets into the media. He drives by the next day and he sees a guy standing there who has like coveralls and a black box that he's turning a dial on and a wire. And he asks him if he needs some help, and he says no. And he sees him the next day and drives by, and this guy's still there. Keel calls the gas company, because that's where the gas line went under the interstate, and said, "Did you guys have any anybody out there checking? And they say no. Do you use this kind of equipment? No. So Keel went and looked at the spot and found some strange footprints. He found that one naked human footprint. He found some footprints that looked like the landing on the moon footprints, and he found some huge animal prints that looked like dog prints, but they were unclassifiable. Then Jones gets some threatening notes to not talk about it, and there was one other thing. He had an encounter with, let me see here. Yeah, I'll move on. He disappeared, basically, is what happened. No one's been ever since. So
did Jones disappear?
Yes, and so that's kind of odd. But the fact that he was an appliance salesman means he probably knew Woody Derenberger, who was the contactee for Indrid Cold, because Woody was also an appliance salesman. Another interesting tie-in between Point Pleasant and Woodward Drive is the fact that Derenberger's psychiatrist, who, as soon as he started saying, I'm visiting this Venusian, Indrid Cold, and he's taking me in his ship, they suggested, Air Force came in and did an exam, and then Woody privately started seeing another psychiatrist named Alan Roberts, and Roberts ends up coming to Woodward Drive and treating my friend who was this Mothman contactee, Timmy. So we have Alan Roberts. One of the parents remembers that he traveled between Charleston, Point Pleasant, and Parkersburg and Huntington, sort of doing this circuit where he was treating kids or people who had UFO contacts. And that's kind of unusual for the late 60s. And it raises questions as to whether or not... Well, the interesting thing is that Roberts then started claiming that he too was being taken to Venus. So we have a guy who believes he's being taken to Venus, who's a psychiatrist, who's treating... This is a medical doctor, right? He's treating contactees. I mean, it's very odd.
To say the least. But you've also, as we said earlier in the show, these people can really believe that, and it either might be one, reality, that it really did happen, or two, they might be under the effects of some kind of mind op or psychological op.
Absolutely. If you read Derenberger's book, he talks about going on this spaceship and flying to Lanulos, but strangely, Lanulos looks just like Brazil.
Okay.
And it conjures up images of Colonia Dignidad,
okay.
The Nazi fortress. Maybe they had a little spot there in the jungle where they would bring contactees and make them think that they, were on Lanulos. But he was also shown footage of Iraq, several cities in Iraq. It's like, why are they showing this contactee certain cities in Iraq?
In what time frame is this? Are we still talking about late 60s or?
Yes. Of course, people think that our involvement in Iraq is only recent, but it started back in 1925, with the agreement that between ExxonMobil, a little bit of French and British involvement with Iraq, and the contract ran out in 2000.
So we're talking about interests like Standard Oil and British Petroleum and such.
Yes.
They were messing around. Yeah, and they were there.
Exxon and Mobil, those are those are split-offs.
That was when Standard Oil before the supposed breakup.
Yeah. So it kind of explains Cheney's oil meetings in 1999, talking about going into Iraq because the agreement was up. So that kind of explains why we're in Iraq. One thing. But why was Woody Derenberger shown Iraq? There's a lot of stuff coming out now. There's a recent History Channel show about Nazi UFOs and how these scientists were brought over via Operation Paperclip and set up in the CIA and NASA. Werner von Braun ran the NASA security operation, strangely. and they had an office in Columbus, which is, about an hour and a half from Point Pleasant. But it could have been that they were using these, if they really did develop these small, most of the UFOs sightings are small. Some of them are only the size of a basketball.
Let me ask you this, now that you said this, because you're piquing my interest. Where were you in 1979?
In 79?
Yeah. Were you in West Virginia?
I was.
All right, hold on a second. Let me think about this. This was either late 78 or early 79, but it was the winter that spans both years. Okay, now I'm going to ask you this. I was in Vermont. I was working at a college, and I ran a late night shift, something like 1 a.m. Saturday morning to 5 a.m. Saturday morning, okay? I go walking up to the college at about 11 p.m., and I'm telling you this for a reason, so, even if we're going to eat up some time, excuse me, I'm looking at the clock now. I just want to run this by you, okay? I'm walking there, and I'm hearing dogs bay like there's something amiss, okay? I look up to the sky that would be to the west, and I'm seeing a UFO. There's no two ways about it. And I'm watching it, my eyes are starting to tear up, because when it's really cold out, as it was at that time of the year, it's probably November 78 or so, okay? It could not have been the winter of 79. And I'm looking at this, and I'm going, my goodness, this is the real deal. And when I went to blink, because finally my eyes couldn't take it anymore, the thing was gone. I'm not going to explain it, I won't do that right now. So what I do is, I go into the radio station, and I begin my set. It was rock and roll, with all kinds of songs like Mr. Spaceman, 8 Miles High, It Came Out of the Sky. You get what I'm doing? And I'm telling people, I'm going to tell you right now that I saw something, and it wasn't it wasn't swamp gas, it wasn't a dirigible. It was, weird. Get this, the next morning in the Boston Globe, it said, sighting seen from West Virginia through the Northeast. Do you remember that at all, in late 78? That there were massive sightings of UFOs through that Northeast corridor from West Virginia up through Maine.
Yes, there were, and there's some old UFO magazines that have articles on it, which I've looked at, and we had a big flap in Charleston. In fact, photos were taken. Some of them were printed in the magazines. Mm-hmm. I had some strange things going on in my life too at that time, just some strange dreams, and another anomalous photograph was taken that I can put on the site for people to look at.
And do that, by the way, Andrew, because, again, as you said even last hour, by the time this hits the stream and the archives, they'll be up there. So by all means do that, because they're going to hit it when this goes up.
Well, we did have these, we had it flapped then, for sure, to answer your question. Mm-hmm. But getting back to Derenberger, he was shown these images of Iraqi cities. Now, it would have been fairly easy, given the technology at the time, because remember, they started mind control back in the 30s, to show him reconnaissance films taken from some aircraft, and then, make him believe that he was flying in a spaceship. So that's certainly a possibility, and especially when you look at the things that these, quote, spacemen were telling the contactees. A lot of it has serious Nazi overtones, like the White Brotherhood that were referred to several times.